About what on your production run?
About 1 million. We'll build 1 million cars next year.
1 million cars? Well, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. That'll do a lot to pull the country out of the depression.
Most people know Henry Ford as the person who popularized automobiles across the world and founded Ford Motor Companies. However, his true impact was far greater. Although Henry Ford is typically referenced in regards to the automobile revolution, Ford caused more significant changes through his influence on the manufacturing and industrialization revolutions, along with the subsequent revolutions in consumerism and class structure.
A man named Henry Ford, who had left the farm and come to the city to tinker with machinery, was making what he called a quadricycle.
Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863 during the Civil War, in a world with no electricity, industrialization, or urbanization. In that era, Americans used horses and carriages as their primary form of individual transportation. Other alternatives for transportation included electric streetcars, which were only available in urban cities, and trains, which were used for long-distance transportation to limited destinations. From a young age, Henry Ford loved to build and experiment with engines. By 15, he had successfully built his own steam engine. Then, Ford spent several years repairing engines for different companies, until in 1891 he was hired as an engineer by the Edison Electric Illuminating Company. During his time at the company, he honed his engineering skills and attempted to build a self-propelling carriage. After years of work, he eventually succeeded on June 4, 1896, with the successful test drive of the quadricycle. For the next 10 years, Ford founded several automobile companies, all of which quickly failed. However, on June 16, 1903, Ford Motor Companies was officially founded in Detroit, Michigan. Over the next several years, the company developed and manufactured several different car models. Though the cars were functional, they were out of budget for most individuals and were not much different than the cars of competitors. Then, on October 1st, 1908, Ford introduced the now famous Model T car. The Model T, contrary to common knowledge, was not inherently revolutionary to the degree that one would expect for such a popular car. What was special about it was that it was cheap, durable, easy to use and repair, and capable of navigating difficult terrain. Though the car was significantly cheaper than earlier models, it still cost $850, meaning it remained out of reach for most consumers. Additionally, the sales were limited by the slow production speeds of the car. It was not until December 1st, 1913 that Ford finally put into effect the major breakthrough that would revolutionize not just the automobile industry, but the entirety of American manufacturing.
As it moved past, each workman put on a different part.
Assembly line is a organized means of bringing the parts together and assembling them together. That's number one. Number two is it's synchronizing the timing. In the assembly line, what happens is every joint you fix, every component that's coming, it has to go together, and there's a time study is done to make sure it is done efficiently.
The assembly line allowed a Ford factory to manufacture a new Model T chassis every 93 minutes, as opposed to the average of 12 hours before the introduction of the assembly line. In other words, the assembly line was revolutionary. It increased supply of Model Ts dramatically, allowing Ford to keep up with growing demand. Furthermore, the efficiency of the assembly line combined with continued improvements in the assembly line process caused the cost of a Model T to drop from $850 at its introduction to only $250 by 1924. The assembly line allowed the Model T to become the first functional car to be available to the majority of consumers across the United States. However, it's important to note that Ford did not in any way invent the assembly line, and in fact, he wasn't even the first to use it for car manufacturing. Ford's revolution was in perfecting the assembly line efficiency, and most crucially combining it with a product that fostered the level of demand needed for an assembly line to be effective. As a result, approximately half of all cars in the US were Model T cars by the late 1920s. And in total, the Model T sold 15 million units. However, this impact was limited to the transportation industry. The larger, more significant revolution was in the assembly line, which transformed not only the automotive industry but all other manufacturing across the United States. The assembly line quickly spread to different industries, and it allowed products to be sold for far cheaper, making them, just like the Model T, accessible to the middle class. During World War I, the assembly line mass production technique allowed the US to manufacture weapons and goods at an unmatched rate compared to other nations, which is why the US played such an important economic role during the war. When the war was over, the assembly line and the cheap products of mass production became directed towards consumers, essentially fueling the Roaring '20s. This developed into early American consumerism, where middle-class Americans bought products and gadgets that they wanted, but that were not basic necessities. A major shift from the buying patterns of the past that demonstrate the revolutionary impact of the assembly line. The other factor, however, in this boost in mass production and large-scale consumerism by the middle class was the second revolutionary aspect of Ford's introduction of the assembly line.
For a real vacation, nothing beats a camping trip.
Even as the company was achieving skyrocketing sales, Ford wanted to ensure that the factory workers were paid well enough to support themselves and be able to afford purchases like a Model T. For this reason, on January 5, 1914, he introduced the revolutionary $5 per day minimum wage at his factories. This way, he could help transform the life of his workers using the immense wealth created through the assembly line system. Or so he claimed. The real reason behind the $5 minimum wage was likely an attempt to minimize the growing worker turnout rate as a result of introducing the assembly line system, which is extremely tedious and demanding compared to traditional factory work. In other words, the $5 per day wage was simply a necessary extension coming from the revolution Ford had introduced with the assembly line. Nevertheless, the wage was far higher than other manufacturing or factory jobs during this time period. As a result, the announcement made headlines nationwide, and the next day thousands of workers swarmed Ford Motor factories, hoping to find a lucrative job. The increased salary provided the workers with enough money to afford more than just basic expenses, liberating them to buy products that they desired or would improve their lives. These buying actions would become the foundation of the modern American middle class, who worked regular jobs yet could afford many unnecessary expenses. This shift in class features is one of the most significant reactions to Ford's minimum wage. And though this demand did not necessarily improve profits, as Ford was the one paying their salary, it demonstrates how consumers affording more products created larger markets and economic incentives for companies wanting to introduce innovative products and technologies, things such as a vacuum cleaner and refrigerator. This trend extends to the economy as a whole, where cheaper assembly line mass-produced goods could be afforded by more middle-class workers who had more money to spend as a result of increased salaries, leading to the companies profiting more and increasing workers' salary, creating a continuous cycle, especially when combined with other trends of the time period such as the use of credit. Furthermore, these trends continue to influence our society today through a resurgence of buying on credit and mass production to an even greater extent than Ford could have ever imagined. Furthermore, Ford's decision forced competitors to improve wages and working conditions, increasing salaries of workers across the United States and revolutionizing the state of the job market. There were still problems with the $5 per day wage. Aside from only being provided to men, the salary was only offered to workers deemed worthy by a new sociological department. However, the department would discriminate against immigrants, people of color, and those of different beliefs. This created a contradictory dynamic, where the department was intended to improve the lives of workers, but it was instead systemizing Ford's own racial biases.
Detroit, Michigan, birthplace of the Ford Motor Company.
Though Ford would continue to influence the company, he resigned as president of Ford Motors in December of 1918, with his son Edsel Ford becoming president. Throughout the period after Ford's resignation, Ford Motors continued to work on improving their cars but fell behind competition significantly due to failing to produce a newer car than the Model T until December 2, 1927 with the introduction of the Model A. Though it was successful, the Model A was far from revolutionary, and over time other companies took the majority of the automobile market share away from Ford. Henry Ford's significance and legacy spans across the many ventures and products that he and his company were involved in throughout his lifetime, the most major being the continued operation of Ford Motors to this day. Ford's most widespread impact, however, is his pioneering of the assembly line. To this day, the assembly line is used by all major car manufacturers. Furthermore, the $5 per day minimum wage set by Ford and its impacts across the industry of manufacturing caused the shift in worker wages that has transformed into a modern middle class that fuels the mass consumerism which powers our modern economy. Based on this, it is evident that Henry Ford's greatest legacy and significance lies not in his introduction of the Model T, but in the improvements that the assembly line and its increased wages brought to the American economy and society as a whole.